Oh, wait. Sorry. I did the wrong thing. Hold on. Let's try this again. This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 1st of December. It doesn't help to talk into your mic when the second you open your mouth, you bring the mic fader down instead of the music fader. It gets very confusing. So I hope everybody had a happy Thanksgiving. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks.
I'm Michael Wade.
And we might as well get right into it. By the way, I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving. So even though we all have to go back to normalcy tomorrow, I hope everybody's Thanksgiving was great.
And then it's a quick slide right into Christmas.
Yeah, right into Christmas. Yeah, I know. But actually, I like this part of the year because, let's see, I just think of it in terms of days off. We get November 11th off. We get 2 days off at Thanksgiving, get a couple of days off at Christmas. So this is the good part of the year. It's when it gets after February, when you enter that long dry spell of 3 months where there's not a day off at all. That's the worst part of the year. But now we're right in the middle of the best part of the year as far as I'm concerned. Plus, it's not 115 degrees out here in the Southern California desert, so that's always great too. Well, Donald Trump yesterday, he did a couple of things. By the way, hi chat, how are you? Welcome to the podcast. So yesterday, Donald Trump, he didn't tweet, he posted on Truth Social, but he posted this. The idea that the BRICs countries are trying to move away from the dollar while we stand by and watch is over. We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICs currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty U.S. dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye into selling into the wonderful U.S. economy. They can go find another, I don't know why this is in quote or scare quotes, but sucker. There is no chance that the BRICs will replace the U.S. dollar in international trade, and any country that tries should wave goodbye to America. Now, we could talk a lot about the economics of this, particular policy and what the possible results will be, and maybe we'll get into that later if we want to talk a little economics. I mean, at some point we have to talk economics. Why not here? That doesn't strike me as the most important thing right now, and it doesn't strike me as the most important thing that we face in terms of our foreign policy at all, which is that the post-World War II international settlement is over. And however well it might have worked whenever we created it 78 years ago in 1946, it doesn't reflect the world the way it exists now. It doesn't reflect the fact that we are in $35 trillion in debt. By the way, do you want to get BRICs? That's how you get BRICs. Ensure that you are going to default on your debt and ensure that your annual interest payments are 1.5 trillion a year. That's how you get BRICs, because everybody expects the dollar is going to collapse because we're going to do it to ourselves. But on top of that, we no longer have this bipolar superpower world where it's the U.S. and Russia. We have a multipolar world with 8 nuclear-armed states now. We have a demographic collapse, basically, in all of the Western industrialized nations, where we're soon going to have more retirees than we have workers. Of course,
that would include Japan and South Korea as well.
Yes, all industrialized countries. We don't live in the post-World War II world anymore. And here's why this bothers me. Not because, I long for the days when America bestrode the world like a colossus, but because of what happens when these international settlements no longer work. The last great international settlement was set up by among others, now I can't even think of his name, Clemens von Metternich, in 1815, 1816. after the Napoleonic Wars, where they created what the new international system was going to look like after the fall of Napoleon. It was a pretty good system. Lasted for 99 years. It wasn't perfect. There were little wars here and there. The Franco-Prussian War, probably the biggest of them, but most of them fairly limited, like the Prussian-Danish War and the Crimean War. Minor kind of little brush fires that seemed important at the time, but were really fairly limited and fairly small. When it fell apart in 1914, and the next 21 years took us through 2 world wars and a global economic depression. And by the way, I think you could argue that the previous international settlement that existed for 100 years, 200 years prior to Napoleon was one that was broken starting with the American Revolution and then the French Revolution, which from 1793 to 1815 was pretty much constant warfare in Europe, because that old international system broke down, the age of monarchies, I guess, to be kind of replaced by a more democratic age. These things are often very violent transitions. And what Trump is doing with this is he's trying to keep the old World War II post-war international settlement alive. I don't think that's the policy. I think the policy is to figure out what the new settlement looks like and to position the United States for an appropriate position of prominence in that new settlement. But just slapping 100% tariffs on the BRICS nations, 2 of whom are essentially our geopolitical opponents and who really have no interest in knuckling under to us. And by the way, we import far more from China than they could possibly import from us.
Yeah, I mean, India and China are the 2 in that BRICS coalition that I don't know how we say that we're going to slap 100% tariffs on them. I don't see that as realistic. Matter of fact, 100% tariff alone is just completely unrealistic.
And by the way, it's not a 100% tariff, especially in the case of, say, India, is not really a threat to a nation that has 100 to 135% tariffs on automobiles and automobile parts, 150% tariffs on alcohol. Indians are quite comfortable with 100% tariffs.
Well, and what you're encouraging them to do is to devalue their currency, and then, they'll meet the tariffs that way.
And what you're also telling them is you have to keep doing all of your international trade in dollars.
In dollars, right.
Never mind the fact that we're $35 trillion in debt and that our annual interest payments alone on our debt have now ballooned to $1.2 trillion a year. And sooner or later, we're going to default on our bonds and make the dollar worthless. There's a reason why BRICS exists. And it's not because everybody thinks the dollar is fantastic and the U.S. government is trustworthy. In fact, one could argue that one of the reasons BRICS exists is because of the U.S.'s tendency to flex its economic muscle to force nations to do things that they wouldn't willingly do. And the whole point of BRICS is to escape that.
I mean, one of the real advantages to having the U.S. dollar be the world reserve currency is that we can impose sanctions. I mean, that's how we get away with sanctions on places like Russia and China, economic sanctions, because we cut them off from the dollar. And you couldn't do that. It wouldn't make any difference if, it was denominated in something else. Although that's the real question. What are the other options?
Well, at the moment, it looks like countries are just starting to hoard gold.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is another warning sign that the U.S. dollar is on its way out. People cannot depend on the United States government to keep the dollar stable. They just can't.
It's a fiat currency. I mean,
yeah, and the only thing that provided its stability was the fact that we simply would not overspend our way into endless debt, that we would keep the dollar strong and keep it worth something. And we haven't held up our end of the deal. So sure, countries are hoarding gold, and other countries like the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians and the South Africans, they're looking for some other alternative measure besides the dollar. And I'm not even sure this is an attack on the dollar. This may just be a clear-eyed realization that we are destroying the dollar ourselves, and that we can't be depended upon to keep the dollar the world's reserve currency.
We've been saying this for 20 some years. We knew it was coming. We've talked about it, I don't know how many times. And yet, going back to a gold standard.
Yeah, gold has its own huge problems.
Right. So I don't know if maybe you could do like a basket of precious metals or something. I don't know.
Well, look, the problem with any sort of hard currency is that it strangles trade. It has to, because the second you start running a trade deficit, it's going to suck the gold, the platinum, the copper, whatever the hell it is that you're using, it's going to suck it right out of your treasury because you've decided it's cheaper to pay more for goods, which is fine as long as you can export as much as you import.
Right.
If you can't do that, then kiss all that gold goodbye, which is, by the way, why we got off the gold standard in the 1930s during the Great Depression, because it was sucking the central bank's gold reserves dry because of imports.
Well, we got partially off of it. It was still pegged, but it wasn't until Nixon, what was that, 71, 73? That we finally got off it, and, just ended Bretton Woods. And that allowed us to do our own fiat currency, which, a lot of problems with it. But there was a question of whether or not there were actually enough gold reserves to be able to support the currency. Although I think I read today that China claims to have discovered like the largest gold deposits, or I guess, ore in the world, worth like 89 trillion or something, or maybe it was billion. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Although, no central government wants to get into the business of now shipping gold around the world in Spanish treasure fleets to pay for their imports. Gold is inconveniently heavy.
We go back to the 15 and 1600s.
Well, yeah, exactly. So the problem is we're trying to keep the post-World War II settlement alive, and I just don't think there's any way to rescue it. Any international environment has to reflect the reality in which you live, not the reality in which your grandparents lived or great-grandparents lived 78 years ago.
Yeah, you can't hold on to the past forever.
Yeah, you're going to have to come to a new. You're going to have to come to a new agreement somehow that everybody can live with.
What will that agreement be? I don't know what the vision would be. I mean, cryptocurrency certainly offers, I think, an interesting alternative. I think it's Bukele down in El Salvador that has made cryptocurrency actually legal tender.
Yeah, except nobody will accept it.
Well, that's the problem. It's and you and I discussed this off air about, you could, I guess, look to the IMF and its special drawing rights, but what could you use that for? I mean, you can't go to the grocery store with it.
Yeah, and look, the problems go far beyond just these. I hate to put it this way in this sense, but these relatively simple economic problems. How do you even have trade in a world where the U.S., whose post-World War II deal was, we will maintain a large navy and we will police the world's trading lanes to protect free trade. We're
And
not, we're
or I
not,
guess decreasingly able to do that.
yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. We haven't had
No.
a 600 ship navy since the 1980s.
Yeah.
We're just not in the business of securing global trade anymore. And
We couldn't handle keeping the Suez Canal free of the Houthi menace.
yeah, exactly. So, it's not just the economic collapse of the post-World War II settlement, it's the political collapse.
In an increasing globalization world. So, yeah, I mean, the problems are kind of trifold in a lot of ways. So we've got a potentially collapsing currency that is the currency of the largest and most versatile market in the world. So you've got that dichotomy. You've got increasing globalization. So there's a need for some sort of reserve currency, some way to keep smaller currencies alive and stable.
And that's
And yet,
trustworthy enough that it can't be controlled by someone who can just willfully collapse it by spending
right.
themselves into unpayable debt.
Or devalue it. So it's we're just in a very tough situation, and by we I mean the entire world, because it doesn't do anybody any good to have the kind of debt levels that we have when so many international trade deals are denominated in dollars, not just ones with the United States, like
All of
between
them.
other nations.
You have to have dollars to buy oil.
Mm-hmm.
Although I guess you'll need a lot less of it since populations are collapsing due to demographic collapse. Which, by the way, what are retirees going to eat? Because we're not going to be able to fund. We're not going to be able to fund pension systems.
Yeah, that's right. Again, something we've talked about for a very long time.
And maybe the
But nobody
question
does
is,
anything about
retirees, what are those?
it. Yeah, right. And that's even a worse problem, right? Because unless the economy is expanding, the retirees need to leave so that the new blood can come in.
Yeah, but if
And
there's no new blood coming in, retirees can't leave. And look, the way that we've tried to paper this over in the West in general has been through immigration, legal and
right.
otherwise. And
how's that working out?
yeah, as it turns out, immigrants are not just fungible economic units who don't bring any of their own ideas about political and social governance of society.
Yeah, rather than the leftist talking point is that they increase our economic benefits, but that's just not true. They actually cost us more than we get from them. Those who actually do work and provide economic stimulus. Far too many. You think about like the crowded schools, hospitals, benefits which somehow they get a hold of. For the life, man, I don't understand that. The amount of federal dollars that goes to settling and resettling them, to giving them stipends and food and hotel rooms. I mean, it is a net cost to the United States.
Yes, but they always defend it that we need all the people to do the work that Americans won't do.
You got to love it too. Every time a lefty, talks about this, they're
Who's
like,
going to clean our
who's going to
toilets?
clean your toilets?
Yeah, which is a very telling idea about what they think the immigrants should be doing.
Well, Consuela,
We need a permanent underclass so that we have easier lives. I mean,
I mean, that's exactly what they're saying.
that's the argument that they're making. But at the end of the day, we don't so much need a permanent underclass as we need workers. And we're not having kids. And look, we're not in hugely bad shape in the United States because we have the millennials. Germany doesn't. France doesn't. Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, they don't. They have nothing. They've got old people, and they're going to keep getting older. China's population is so old that it's going to decline by half over the next 50 years.
And their younger populations aren't doing anything. They're still living at home. They don't have jobs.
They don't have jobs. They don't have any, and thus have no work skills. So, how are they going to take over? We're entering a world that we've never actually seen before. The only countries that are really still living in the world of the past, where there is no demographic collapse, where they will always be able to have more workers, well, at least currently have more workers than they have retirees, are countries like Africa or Central and South America, where they have the normal traditional sort of population pyramids. That just doesn't exist anywhere in the industrialized world. And look, to the extent that our demographics haven't completely collapsed here in the United States, partially thanks to the millennials, but also, hate to say it, thanks to immigration.
Yeah, look, immigration is not a bad thing. It's the illegal immigration where we bring in these non-qualified, non-productive leeches.
And by the way, you said it right, where we bring them in, because that's what we are doing.
Yes, that's right. That's the open borders policy.
And we're even ensuring that they're not illegal by changing their immigration classification with the whip of
so we just basically changed the name.
Yeah, you're a refugee.
Right.
You get a free pass.
That solves the problem. That's just so disgusting.
Yeah. So, this tariff threat. First of all, we don't import shit from Russia, so what do they care?
Right.
We don't import much from India because they don't export a bunch because they're still trying to keep up with increases in local demand.
We do import a lot of high tech goods, things like that. But South Africa, we don't. I mean, what do we import from South Africa? Wine?
Yeah, maybe. That's fine. We still have California.
Or even Brazil nuts. I mean, what are we getting from Brazil?
The big one in that group is China.
Absolutely, which we import a shit ton of stuff from.
And
maybe we shouldn't.
Look, maybe we shouldn't, but I mean, what are we going to do? Build a whole bunch of textile plants so our 8-year-olds have a place to work? Because that's the direction we'd have to head in.
Well, and the other thing too is, one of the benefits of being the world reserve currency is that we have really cheap borrowing costs for our treasuries compared to everybody else in the world.
Right up until the point we default on a payment.
Yeah. And that's the problem. It's so it's so easy to borrow. Well, might as well. Just go ahead, do it. More treasuries. At some point though, those people have got to get nervous. Especially, places like China, where they have a lot of U.S. treasuries. And what are they going to do with it?
Yeah, because if they bring it back, they might as well be slapping a tariff on their own goods if
That's
they
exactly
bring
right.
that back, because they've got to convert that to renminbi, which will, drive down the value of the renminbi, which means that their exports will become much, much more expensive. I mean, we have worked our way into this awful, awful box, and the system that we used to create that box is starting to collapse. And I don't know that anybody is looking ahead as to what does this mean in the future. And let's not even forget about the things that we don't want to talk about that have been going on in the rest of the world, like the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, which still appears to be proceeding apace. It's looking like the Bashar Assad regime in Syria is looking increasingly iffy, which I guess will be a big black eye if Assad gets overthrown and the Russians and the Iranians get thrown out. But it's not like, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are going to be taking over in Syria. It's going to be a bunch of Al-Qaeda nut jobs.
Right. It's going to be the second rising of ISIS.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have that going on in the background. You mentioned a few minutes ago the whole problem with the Houthis in Yemen. That whole region, that's 1.2 billion people that apparently can't be trusted not to just shoot anything that moves if they get a chance.
Yeah. By the way, you mentioned we both mentioned the Houthis, but apparently Russia has made a point of recruiting a bunch of people from Yemen, Houthis, to come and live. Look, we'll pay you to come here and live in Russia, and then turn around and turn them into soldiers like immediately. More cannon fodder.
Well, technically, they're getting paid. They're getting paid by the
Mm-hmm.
Russian Ministry of Defense.
Right.
Yeah, well, the Russians. Look, he grabbed a hold of this freaking Ukraine tar baby, and now he can't. He's stuck. He can't let go. You can't shake it off.
How did they not know that? How did they not know?
Because in 2014, they walked in with freaking marching bands and everything went swimmingly.
Into Crimea, yeah.
And everything went swimmingly. He had every reason to think and by the way, he did it in Georgia in 2016, and everything went fine. So he had every reason to believe in 2022 he could tritty-trot in there, overthrow Zelensky in Kiev, put his puppet, Yanukovych or whoever he wanted, back in control, and then march out and everything would be hunky-dunky. He did not expect what happened to happen. And the trouble with Russia and their armed forces has always been, if anybody puts up any resistance, they just collapse like a sack of Jell-O.
Yeah, well, they're using, barely post-World War II arms for most of this stuff. I mean, rusty tanks and
oh yeah, they're pulling T-55s out of depot parking.
right.
T-72s.
Their Navy, to the extent they have one, is pretty decrepit. I don't know what they were thinking.
Again, they thought
it
they would.
was just a bad idea.
They thought they'd march in just like they did in 2014. I don't think he realized how much the sentiment had changed in Ukraine. This is always one of the problems. By the way, this is not an uncommon problem. Same problem that Adolf Hitler had when he invaded Ukraine in 1941. The Ukrainians were just happy, like little girls, to see the Nazis come marching into Ukraine in 41, thinking, oh, you're liberating us from the communists. You're getting rid of Stalin. Yay, we're so glad you're here. Wait a second. Why are you shooting us all? Hold on.
Yeah, right. Wait, how are you different?
Yeah, exactly. And they just ended up making enemies of the Ukrainians. And the weird thing is that after 50 years in the Soviet Union, the Ukrainians were kind of starting to think of themselves as Soviet citizens. And so what does Vladimir Putin do? He invades them in such a way as to awaken, which has always been around, but to awaken this Ukrainian national identity that had been kind of subsumed post-World War II by the Soviet Union. Well, what better way to recreate that than to just march right on in with your army again? And now you're creating, he is literally creating a sense of a Ukrainian nation, Certainly not for everybody. Certainly not for those who live in Western Ukraine, who consider themselves far more Russian than Ukrainian. And that probably includes most of Crimea.
Well, it's Eastern. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Eastern Ukraine. And look, Ukrainians may have to give all of that up. There are a whole bunch of ethnic Russians that live there that don't consider themselves Ukrainians. They consider themselves Russian, and they want to be part of Russia. The reality is, at the end of the day, absent some miracle, which I don't see coming, Russia is going to end up with a good portion of the Donbass and Crimea.
Yep. Yeah. Ukraine is not going to be the same country it started out as. I don't see any way around that.
And look, the people they're getting rid of are people who don't want to be Ukrainians anyway, people who consider themselves Russian. So basically
and like you
eastern
said,
third of the
been
country.
that contingent. Yeah, there's always been that contingent. And Russia has always made sure to keep that connection alive. I mean, when they were working very hard behind the scenes to install their own little puppet prime ministers and presidents, they kept that hope alive. And Ukraine is not exactly a bastion of democratic health.
No, it's not even
been quite corrupt.
It's not, by the way, a democracy right now.
No, it's not. Matter of fact, Zelensky canceled the elections.
Yeah,
not unheard of during a time of war, but
we didn't do it in World War II.
No. Of course, we weren't being invaded in our home.
Yeah, all right, sure, appreciated. But the fact is, Zelensky is essentially president by decree at this point.
Yeah, and I don't trust Zelensky. I mean, I think he's better than Poroshenko, but I'm not sure that's a huge step up. I mean, and that's what it takes to survive in that world. Okay, fine.
And look, now he's talking about joining NATO.
Right. Oh, yeah.
No.
I don't see the point to that.
And by the way, speaking of the post-World War II settlement, NATO, why still exactly?
Yeah, it really does seem to be, all we've done is essentially let everybody else produce no guns, all butter, and we provide all their guns. At great cost to us, and treasure, and blood.
And by the way, also at a significant restriction of our military alternatives in many ways.
That's right.
Because now we are tied to Europe through NATO. But we're tied to Europe through NATO to defend against the threat of the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. And look, no matter what you think of Vladimir Putin and him rolling tanks towards Kiev, he ain't invading NATO.
No, he couldn't make it past the border of Poland.
It would be a
even with Belarus's help, they could not make it past the border of Poland.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they could make it to Moldova again, temporarily, but that would be it. I mean, Russia as a ground threat is over. Right. So why does NATO exist anymore? Other than it exists because it exists. We created it, and it's a thing that we do.
And I can never get an answer from people when I ask them that question.
Yeah,
well, Trump's going to take us out of NATO, and that's going to be okay. But why would that be awful? What is it that we're worried is going to happen if we get out of NATO, or if we just disband it? Because without us, there is no NATO.
Look, what George H.W. Bush should have done when the Soviet Union collapsed, and he should have been followed up on this with Bill Clinton, was we should have marched into Brussels and told NATO the Soviet Union no longer exists. The purpose for which this defensive alliance was purportedly created, and I use purportedly intentionally, is now over. That threat is gone. The Warsaw Pact has been dissolved. It's time for you guys to create your own European deal, and we'll head back over the pond.
Right.
Look, if
Hey, we'll support your European deal to a certain extent,
yeah, if some really
but
bad
it
shit
needs to be
happens,
a European deal.
yeah, and some bad shit happens, hey, give us a call. We'll pick up the phone. On
Yeah.
the other hand, you guys have got to figure stuff out for yourselves. When it was
That
the
was one of the
Soviet,
most effective things that Trump did in his first uh, uh, term was getting them to spend more on military, and still they didn't spend enough. I mean, Germany is woefully inadequate. I mean, they have almost no working parts. France at least has some really, really effective special forces. Uh, Britain, not the Britain of old, obviously, but they've still got, they got some moxie. But
and,
who else can you depend on in the rest of Europe?
yeah, but
Oh,
the
Poland,
trouble
you can depend.
the trouble is NATO's yet another one of those things that we have come to accept as just sort of the natural state of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody gets look. Why do we call the United Nations the United Nations? Because that's what we called the Allies in World War II. Go back and look at the old news reels from 44 and 45. United Nations forces have retaken Paris. Yeah, it was the United Nations. It was the World War II allies. We're the ones that created the United Nations in 1942, and we created an organization with the same name in 45. And we think of it, and we think of it as this
permanent committee.
yeah, and we think of it as this thing that exists because it must exist, just like NATO exists because it must exist. No. These were all stuff that we just created on the fly in 1946 and 1947 because it seemed like a great idea at the time. But is it?
We just all you have to do is look at the UN permanent was the permanent select committee, permanent
the
committee,
Security Council,
Security Council.
United States,
It's
China,
us, Britain, China, Russia,
France,
and France. Yeah, I mean that tells you all you need to know.
yes, the five major World War II allies, and I'm being generous with France. End up
and China
end up as the permanent members of the Security Council and the five with veto power. It literally is the United Nations of 1943 and 1944.
Yeah,
And
the only reason China's there is because of Japan.
And by the way,
that's literally the only reason.
And the China that's there now is not the China that was there whenever it was created. We swapped Chinas in 1973.
Typically when you have a change of ownership, there's a clause that will kick you out.
Yeah, so we accept all of these things as normal and natural and the way that the world should be. And we don't realize that most of these things we just came up with because it reflected the world the way it looked in 1946.
Well, and that's sort of the 20th century order of things, right? That we look to these governmental institutions in order to keep things even and an even keel. That's kind of the story of a lot of 20th century history, especially here in the United States. This is when we started. I mean, obviously, the alphabet agencies under FDR, although Hoover had his own, and Wilson had his own, and then the Great Society, under LBJ. I mean, it's this idea that government is this neutral actor that will, just kind of smooth things out and make things okay and keep everyone safe. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. All you're creating are, special interests
that will never go away because they get funded by Congress now every
Right.
single year. That's why, Trump and putting, Vivek and Elon in charge of this Doge thing, with its amusing
I
name.
think it's hilarious they're going to call it Doge.
Yeah, I think it's hilarious too. And I also think it's hilarious that they're going to accomplish anything.
Well, I
Because,
mean, all they can do is make suggestions.
and that's all they're going to be able to do. And Congress is
Right.
going to look at them and say, but wait a second. I keep my job by giving away free shit. And now you want to shut down the avenue where I shovel out the free shit. Yeah,
Right.
good luck with that.
You're not shutting off my spigot to votes.
Yeah, exactly. And the American voter, and Chris and I were talking about this earlier tonight, and one of the things I said to her is the American voter hasn't yet figured out that the threat of getting less free shit is nowhere near as great as the threat of getting no free shit at all. And we are heading towards the you don't get any free shit.
I would like that. Yes, please.
Yeah, but that's not. There are a lot of people who are not prepared to live in that world because
No.
the government is just a
They become
reliable.
dependent.
Yeah, the government is a reliable source of income and support for most people. And by the
And
way,
that was the point.
and by the way, 2/3 of our spending is not on giving money to Ukraine or buying tanks and planes for the Department of Defense. 2/3 of it is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Yeah, good luck
Right.
reforming that. Because
Yeah.
the second you tell old people, hey, Medicare is going to be insolvent, and
Medicare is insolvent.
yeah, and Social Security is going to be insolvent, and by the way,
Insolvent.
it is insolvent, and sooner or later, either those checks are going to dry up, or in a world of hyperinflation, your $1,600 a month check will allow you to buy, a single Lucy cigarette. Because of hyperinflation. And so your Social Security will be worthless unless you allow us to change the program. And as soon as they hear change the program, it's all commercials of Republicans pushing Granny off a cliff.
That's right.
Because everybody
Which is why there's never been any serious attempt to reform it. Even George W. Bush tried to talk about reforming it.
Yeah,
and they went apeshit.
That lasted for about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
George W. Bush came out in, what was it, 2005 or so? 2006?
Something like that, yeah.
And he said, look, Social Security is insolvent, essentially. We've got at least $100 trillion in liabilities. We don't have the money to pay those checks. It's not going to happen now, but at some point, 10, 20 years, 30 years in the future, Social Security is just not going to be able to pay a check to anyone unless we fix it now.
And the only thing, I recall, the only thing he talked about was transferring at least part of those Social Security and Medicare payments into market-based accounts.
On a voluntary basis.
Right.
And the response was, no, I can't hear you. No. Okay. And that's the last anybody tried to do that. Look, same thing happened. Clinton, with the Community Reinvestment Act, Clinton went to Congress in 1998, 1999. Bush went back in 2004 and said the CRA is creating a real estate bubble, and if we don't fix it, it's going to burst and it's going to take the economy down with it. Okay, Clinton started talking about that in 98. And Barney Frank, among others in Congress, said, how dare you try to prevent Americans from buying their own home?
I think Maxine Waters was a big one in that too. The renowned economist, Maxine Waters.
The American people are bound and determined to have their free shit until it becomes impossible to give them anything. And then they'll sit there in the rubble of their lives and wonder, why didn't someone warn me that this was going to happen?
I mean, that's the human nature, right?
Yeah, the trouble is having seen it coming for so long, and having talked about it for so long, I
Well, this is what happens when you infantilize entire generations.
and by
I think Gen X is probably the last generation to not be infantilized with this stuff.
And by,
Uh,
and by the way, this infantilization is new because remember one of the reasons why Bill Clinton got elected was to balance the budget, and then after 2 years of
right.
him screwing around, Newt Gingrich came along and said, "Yeah, this clown says he'll balance the budget. We'll really do it." And people voted in Republicans, and holy
Yep.
smokes, for a couple of years at the end of the '90s, we balanced the frickin' budget,
Yeah. Well, the budget,
such as it
like we
was.
had a budget.
Let's not look into it too deeply. But the fact is, we cut the deficits down to nothing.
We did. Now, it helped that it was during the 90s. We were getting major tax receipts coming, and the economy was growing off the .com boom. But yes, that's true. We finally had a little bit, not entire, but a little bit of some fiscal responsibility going on.
Yeah, but
Something
apparently,
that hadn't happened for 20 years prior.
and look, by the way, I think if it had not been for 9/11, we would have kept that up. And then once 9/11 happened, all that shit went right out the window. Nobody
It
cared
sure
about
did.
deficits. Nobody cared about, I mean, it so thoroughly and completely removed that as a concern from the minds of Americans that now you can't make them think about it.
It's the numbers are really hard to fathom, and they're just like they're just numbers now. They don't mean anything to anybody. They don't understand
Yeah, they're too big
that
to grasp. It's like talking about, light years.
infinity.
But I don't know. I just saw that 100% tariff thing, and I thought, okay, two of those
You
nations,
can't be serious about that.
yeah,
I
two of
can't
those
believe you're
nations,
serious.
two of those nations are going to tell us to go fuck ourselves, at least,
Yeah.
maybe three, and the other two,
Who
one of them
cares?
might have some concerns, but they have their own 125% tariffs, so it's not like they're in a position to preach to us about anything. And the other country is China, who actually needs to export to us more than we need to export to them. And maybe China's the only one that you have to move. The trouble is, China's run by a guy who is never told the truth about how the world works, because people who tell him the truth get shot in the back of the head or sent off to re-education camps.
Right.
So how do you get reality through the head of a guy who doesn't like to be told what reality looks like? And how do you
Well, De
expect him to
Silva,
respond in a realistic fashion?
yeah, I was gonna say De Silva and uh, what's his face in South Africa aren't exactly paragons of truth either.
Yeah, I mean, these are not good guys that we're dealing with. Well,
No.
I guess the Indians, they have a multi-party democracy, more or less. So
Yeah, the Indians are great to deal
the
with.
Indians are
It-
fine.
it-
But everybody else in BRICS is an asshole.
yes, that's my estimation as well.
And if you threaten assholes, don't expect them to respond to your threats. Especially
No.
when two of the three assholes don't trade with you anyway.
Right. That's what makes it kind of weird. Although even BRICS, well, we're going to come up with our own currency. Oh yeah, what the hell is that going to be?
Yeah, it better be gold because that's the only thing people are going to accept because nobody
You're gonna
wants
base it off the renminbi? Really?
Yeah, maybe the renminbi looks really attractive in Somalia, but outside of that, even in Botswana, they're going to say, yuan? Really? No.
Renminbi or hard cold cash dollars.
Yeah, exactly. So,
I mean, there's probably more actual hard money floating around outside of this country than there is inside.
yeah, there probably is. I think, though, at some point, Washington, D.C. needs to realize that the days of throwing our economic weight around are probably coming to a close. And by the way,
well, depending on how you do it, yes, that's right.
And by the way, we're the ones that closed the door on it because we decided we were just going to give away $35 trillion in free shit.
Well, that's just it. We started going more to the butter. I mean, to the exclusion of guns. Our military is a wreck right now, and
yet
we have no way to enforce this.
And yet a wreck that can't figure out what it did with $7 billion.
I know, Jesus.
Or sorry, $700 billion.
And so Pete Hegseth, well, he has no experience. He can't do this. He doesn't know what he's going to do. I mean, come on. It's like, well, the people who did know what to do, what the fuck did they do? They're experts, right?
Yeah, they lost $700 billion. That's what they did. The experts lost $700 billion. Well, Pete Hegseth isn't going to fix that. Well, since everybody else who's competent has failed at it, maybe we should just take a shot in the dark. New
tax.
Well, see, that's the problem with the whole expertise argument. It doesn't work anymore.
Mm-mm.
Because
pandemic killed that.
All the problems that we have are caused because we followed the advice of the experts. Because
we went the dirigised way and the technocratic way.
As it turns out, the experts are giving us advice based on things other than apparently actual expertise.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's his face? Buchanan, Nobel Prize winner, author of public choice theory, predicted this 30 years ago. I mean, well, predicted. He described it, much like Adam Smith described economics. He didn't create economics. He pointed out that just because you're in government does not make you some sort of paragon of virtue, that you have no interest in the game. Everybody has interests. And if the policies you're being asked to follow are not in line with your own interest, you're not going to follow them. You're going to find ways around them. And we've seen that happen now for a very long time.
Yeah, well, once your expert class gets captured by ideology, you can no longer depend on their expertise because that's not what they're giving you.
Absolutely. And we see this a lot in like medical research, scientific research. Unless you're giving the people who are funding the grants and scholarships and whatever else, unless you're giving them what they expect, you won't see that money anymore.
Yeah, why fund you when they can fund someone who they're fairly certain
who's more compliant,
will give them the result they want to hear?
Right.
Well, speaking of the entrenched government experts, another firestorm. Trump keeps speaking about Hegseth. Hegseth is an easy pass through Congress.
Small potatoes, yeah.
Compared to Kash Patel at the FBI. We've already got FBI agents saying that if Kash Patel gets in here, we're leaving. Now, I say FBI agents. What I mean is people who work at the J. Edgar Hoover Federal Building in Washington,
right,
D.C.
Not all of them are agents.
Not all the field agents in Omaha, Nebraska. But we talked about last podcast, we titled Heads Exploding based on Trump's first round of nominees. Well, you want to talk about heads exploding? Let's take a look at Joe Walsh. Do not normalize Trump. He is an enemy of this country. This latest pick only confirms it. Biden and Harris must not go to his inauguration. Everyone must speak out. Trump is trying to destroy this country. This is not normal. Time to resist. It's past time. Okay, well, good to know that civil war is still on the table. But this seems like
it's a shame. He was so good with the Eagles, too.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like, I don't know, maybe a little overreaction to Kash Patel going to the FBI. And the other
Kash
thing...
Patel, well, I mean, think about what his version... He's very, very smart. He is incredibly industrious. And he doesn't have any fear. And he knows what the mission is. It's to clean house, get ducks in a row, and get that house in order. Otherwise, the only other choice is to get rid of the FBI, come up with something else.
Well, here's the thing. What we're hearing from people is the FBI is supposed to be non-politicized and a neutral organ. First of all, the FBI is a freaking part of an executive department. Okay, so let's not pretend it is non-political. It should be non-partisan, and it should be objective and unbiased in its pursuit of crime. But for you to say the FBI needs to be kept a non-partisan, non-political organization is to assume that that's what it is now. And I have bad news for you. That's not what it is. This is not an argument against making the FBI a politicized organization. It's against ending that politicization, because it's being politicized, and it has been politicized in the right way. And now we're threatening to overturn that. Or at least Trump is threatening to overturn that.
I mean, it's a lot like the arguments against Elon Musk buying Twitter. Wait a minute, whoa. We can't do whatever we want. We can't censor whoever we want. We can't go after whoever we want.
Why, they'll just be...
No, that's not going to be okay.
There'll be disinformation everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they've gone after Catholics. They've gone after parents at school board meetings. I mean, what the hell do they even do?
Yeah,
that's worthwhile.
People in the military who use terms like liberty may be tied to violent extremist groups.
Right.
I mean, look, if you're in the military, liberty should be a word that you're fairly familiar with.
Yeah, and support.
Yeah, it's kind of what you're there to defend. What we really want is what the people on the left really want is an FBI that's politicized in a way that they like, that will go after people they dislike, and that will shut down things that they don't think should be legal, even though they are. And that is being threatened. What is being threatened is not a change of America from a free country to some sort of tyranny, but it's an attack on the tyranny that they've been supporting.
Right. I mean, there's really no question about this. And we saw it play out over the last 8 years, 9 years. We have so many concrete examples of how politicized the FBI has become that people just don't believe it anymore. And even people that don't even like Trump, and they see how ridiculous and how hypocritical this stance is.
And then to see Andy McCabe come out publicly and say, well, I just can't believe, I can't believe that Trump would do this wonderful organization that I led. This is an organization you lied to. In fact, you lied to it so badly that if it had been me or any other American citizen, you'd have had us arraigned in front of a federal judge so fast on a felony of lying to the FBI, which he did on multiple occasions.
Yep.
And then you sit here and talk to me about the integrity of the FBI and how this threatens it? No. You were the threat to the integrity of the FBI, and the FBI didn't even have the guts to punish you for it. Hell, they couldn't even, forget putting you in jail, they wouldn't even take away your fucking pension.
That fucking kills me. He got fired, right before he was going to reach the mark.
And fired for committing a felony of lying during an official FBI investigation.
And somehow got an administrative law judge to reinstate his benefits. Fucking piece of shit. Should be in jail.
And him, and by the way, the other one, James Comey, I never want to hear a word from either of those two guys about integrity or leadership or impartiality or justice.
I happen to know some FBI people, and they have never, ever held, and these aren't Trump people. They never liked James Comey. They found him to be disingenuous, political, and vindictive.
I think they all are at that level.
I would agree. I
I,
mean,
I, I
look,
think that's how you survive in the
that's how you
Washington,
hold on
D.C.
to
environment.
power. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. And you ruthlessly go after anybody who questions it.
And you've got lots of channels and lots of friends.
And, James
And they have the
Comey,
same similar interests. They want to keep, this is, again, I call it the nouveau regime as opposed to the ancien regime. The nouveau regime wants to stay in power. And that's what all these hissy fits and lawfare and it's the end of the world, the Chicken Little shit. That's what it's all about, because they sense that they're losing their power, but they're going to lose it. Either way, they can lose it peacefully or they can lose it not so peacefully. But they're going to lose it.
And I think it irks them more than anything else that it's this narcissistic buffoon that appears to be on the path to doing it.
Hey, look, you had to send Napoleon in to change things, right?
Only Nixon could go to China.
Right.
So only the crooked New York billionaire can figure out how to get these crooks out of power.
Although, how crooked could he be if they haven't found anything real?
Well,
that's always surprised me.
Yeah, look, I get that, and maybe crooked is too strong a term, but I think of Dave Chappelle on Saturday Night Live several years ago, where he talked about Trump going by and saying, in the debate that the system is rigged against you, and they said, "Well, Mr. Trump, how do you know the system is rigged?" "I know because I used it," and he said, "That's the first time I've ever heard, a rich white man tell the truth like that." And that's why he got elected the first time, by the way. So maybe,
absolutely, yeah.
Maybe crooked is the wrong term, but certainly someone who knows how to use the system. And look, it's just like when Hillary Clinton said, "Well, you don't pay any taxes." Well, maybe you should have wrote the tax laws better.
Yeah, right. I've never been in Congress. I didn't create the tax laws.
Yeah, I mean, and so this is the guy that they hate so much. He's the outsider. He doesn't know anything about politics. He shouldn't even be here. His first election was a complete fluke. The fact that he beat Kamala Harris, who was so full of joy and so brat, this is just beyond the pale that this guy is going to walk, this enemy of this traitor, this Putin asset is going to walk back in. And by the way, they're going to call him a Putin asset again, because as soon as he takes over as president, he is going to eventually realize the inevitable, which is that Ukraine is not going to keep half of Donbass and all of Ukraine. And the only way out of this is to give it to Russia. Russia needs Crimea, because if they don't have it, they have no base at all for the Black Sea Fleet, such as it is. And they're not going to give it up. And by the way, the Russians went to war for it. We talked about it briefly a little earlier, at least I mentioned it, during the Crimean War. The Russians decided they were going to take Crimea, and they took it. And the British and the French were unable to drive them out of it. That's the only warm water port Russia has. They're not giving it up. That's the reality.
This anachronistic quest for the warm water port that Russia has had for
good luck getting the Baltic or the Black Sea Fleet to sail anywhere, and B, sail through the Dardanelles past Turkey and the Straits of Bosporus.
Yeah.
If Turkey wants to, they could sink your entire fleet from shore while you tried to pass through the Bosphorus.
Happened before. It could happen again.
It has happened before. But hey, look, Russia has wanted that warm water port forever. Crimea, as far as Russia is concerned, is part of Russia. And by the way, Russia has 10 times the manpower of Ukraine. At the end of the day, Ukraine is not going to be able to hold it.
Only because they're bringing in the Norks and the Houthis.
Yeah, and look, the Russians have allies that the Ukrainians don't. And now, because of Trump,
Ukrainians don't have many allies who will supply them with anything more than weapons and money.
right, although, both the Brits and the French now have been talking about, well, when Trump takes over, we may have to send troops to fight in Ukraine. At that point, I would tell NATO to
We're done.
fuck totally off.
Yeah.
You are not dragging us into a war with a nuclear armed state over the Ukraine. You're just not. And you can claim Article 5 all you want. You weren't attacked. You're now the aggressor. All bets are off.
Let me ask you, do you wonder?
And by the way, but let me make it clear. I despise Russia and I despise Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is one of the chief focuses of evil in the modern world. He runs Russia like a gangster, like it's his own personal dog kennel. And he has no interest in freedom.
He is a gangster.
Yeah,
it's a kleptocracy.
And the head of the general who runs Soviet military procurement has a $30 million dacha outside of Moscow. I'm pretty sure that he's procuring something other than arms and munitions for the Russian armed forces. He's procuring quite a lot for himself. They're all a bunch of gangsters. So this is not, I hope Russia wins. I love Russia. I feel like Henry Kissinger did when he was asked about the start of the Iran-Iraq war. It is a shame that both sides can't lose.
Who was the that Mexican drug lord?
However, I will say this. Once you invade another country, again, all bets are off. You've lost control. Yeah. You've now given other people a vote in whether you win or not.
You have invited the scrutiny and the vitriol and possibly the attacks. Yes.
Yeah. So you don't get to paint yourself as the innocent victim when it's not Ukrainian tanks rolling into Moscow.
Unless you are Palestinian. Then you can do that.
Yes. Well, when you live in that open air prison, what else do you expect?
Well, I was going to say that Mexican drug lord was his name Chapaco, whoever
El Chapo.
Yeah, that guy. I kind of consider if El Chapo was running Mexico, which kind of sort of was, that's the same thing as Putin running Russia. And that's just how it works. I mean, that's just reality there.
Yes,
and after the Soviet Union, it wasn't so different. Yeah, you didn't have the Stasi anymore, but you still are under.
Yeah, but look, at the end of the day, I'm uninterested in getting into a war with a nuclear armed power over Ukraine. And look,
that's what I was going to ask you.
And Trump, by the way, is going to make that deal or something very similar to it. And all we're going to hear is, see, we told you.
He may do it before he even becomes president.
We told you Trump was a Russian asset. And for Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron to go out and say, well, maybe we should start thinking about sending our troops into Ukraine. Do you want nuclear missiles to fly? Are you trying to start World War III? And look, there is a conspiracy theory that's been going around that this whole thing now is set up to force World War III right after Trump gets inaugurated. To just set up a world situation where a war with Russia is essentially inevitable. And it's hard to think of a better way of doing that than sending British and French troops into Ukraine to fight the Russians.
Well, I think it's clear that Biden and the Democrats were pushing, well, I should say Obama, were pushing to keep this war alive for, I'm sure, various financial reasons, but also because there's a certain thinking amongst politicians, especially establishment politicians, that in any kind of war situation, the current regime needs to be kept in place, right? For stability.
I'm sorry.
During a wartime situation.
I'm sorry. I hate to interrupt you. but this just in. Joe Biden pardoned his son Hunter tonight.
Wow.
A reversal
Shocker.
for the president, who repeatedly said he would not use his executive authority to pardon his son or commute his sentence. Hunter Biden was scheduled to be sentenced on December 12th for his conviction on federal gun charges. He was set to be sentenced also on December 16th in a separate criminal case in which he pleaded guilty to federal tax evasion charges in September. The president issued a full and unconditional pardon for any offenses Hunter has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from January 1st, 2014 through December 1st, 2024, according to the White House statement.
Shocker.
So
this is my shocked face.
So that's over. Well, you probably saw my shocked face. I just couldn't believe that, he said he wasn't going to do it, said he would. But of course, it's Joe Biden. How would you ever depend on anything that Joe Biden says? So pardon the interruption, but that's real live news coming through from Washington, D.C. So let's go to chat. So here we go, chat. Inebriated Plutarch. Hi, by the way. Thanks for watching the show. So Biden just pardoned Hunter. The end. Free pass for the Biden family. I guess that, and another one, I guess that includes any crimes involving influence peddling. Well, yes, a pardon for any crimes he has or
that's right.
may have committed.
Any federal crimes.
Yeah, any federal crimes. Well, that is a full and blanket pardon. The real question, getting back to what we were talking about before I interrupted you, the real question is whether or not the citizens of France and Britain would actually fight.
It's a good question. I mean, we talked about the strength of their militaries earlier. And while I think both have somewhat formidable militaries to a certain extent, it's limited. It's very limited.
Both France and Britain have military forces that would serve as a credible deterrence to invasion.
Yes.
Their ability to project military power is limited overseas, but it is far less limited on the continent of Europe. So technically, both Britain and France could deploy fairly large armed forces into Ukraine.
To a certain extent, yes. The maneuverability is not great, and you'd see it coming from 8,000 miles away.
Well, the problem is that Ukraine has kind of devolved into trench warfare because neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians can impose a war of mobility. You start throwing in a couple of regiments of Chieftain tanks and a couple of regiments of Leclerc, follow that up by infantry and engineer support, and I think we would roll through the Russians like a hot knife through warm butter. And it would be a war.
Good at infiltration forces.
It would be a war of mobility that the Russians could not retreat fast enough.
Well, what the British could definitely add to it is air mobility. That's something that they would be very good at, and the Russian air systems are not good. So you'd have some superiority there.
We'd have air supremacy within 24 hours, and then the Russians would be able to do nothing. But then what do you do with those troops? Do you run them right up to the border of Russia and then stop? Because
that's what I don't understand. Because what are you going to do? You can't invade.
Because the second you step across into Russia, all bets are off. Because the Russians, look, every country publishes what their nuclear doctrine is. Oh, and by the way, Russia's just revised theirs.
Yeah, they lowered the standards.
Yeah, about when we're going to launch nukes. Everybody who has nukes, with the exception of the Israelis, who won't admit that they have them, which is pretty ominous by itself. But all the major countries with nukes have a published nuclear policy. This is how they tell each other, this is when we will definitely nuke you, and everything else is a gray area. But if you do this, we will definitely nuke you. And
yeah, it's the red line.
And Russia's nuclear policy makes it clear that what the red line is. And if British and French troops took a step inside Russia, there is an excellent chance. I don't think Russia would launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, but
they might launch strategic ones, though.
No, but I guarantee, not strategic, but I guarantee you that short range or intermediate range missiles, nuclear missiles, they'd probably launch them. Just to back them away from the border and to make it clear you will not invade Russia.
And somehow Poland's going to get the worst of it again.
Yeah, well, that's the way it always seems to happen. But, you know, this war is going to end, and it's probably going to end with Russia in control of more territory than the Ukrainians want, less territory than the Russians want, but I don't know how you can realistically expect to have a pre-2022 Ukraine reconstituted.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I don't. If Ukraine was more powerful, I could see pushing back, but
it's got 1/10 the population and resources.
Yeah, they just don't have those kind of resources. No matter how much money we give them, which they can't even fucking account for.
Yeah, and look, by the way, mostly we're not giving them money. Mostly we're giving them equipment.
Arms.
Yeah. So, I mean, mostly when we talk about we're giving them $40 million, what we really mean is we're giving them $40 million worth of artillery and missiles. And,
well, we're giving Raytheon and...
Yeah, what we're doing is we're giving Raytheon $40 million to produce the missiles to replace the ones that we're about to send over to Ukraine.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a very daunting proposition. And Ukraine is going to have to get used to this idea. And know that in the end, more lives will be saved by seeking a ceasefire than by trying this quixotic attempt to regain the Crimea and Donetsk.
Also, I think there's been a little mission creep in the West about this. Because I think what there was a lot of, you know, the normal emotional stuff about, oh, this is awful, this is horrible, invading another sovereign nation, blah, blah, blah. This aggression cannot stand. Okay, great. And so the idea was, look, let's give the Russians as big a black eye as we can. Let's start shipping over 88 millimeter mortars and 155 millimeter artillery, or 125 or 105 artillery shells. Hell, let's send them guns. Let's extract a price from Russia, and let's embarrass them as much as possible and make this as expensive as it can be. And then the Russians did what the Russians often do whenever they first get involved in a war. They fuck it up and completely go incompetent. And once that happened, I think people in Western governments began to get some hope. Maybe we can beat this son of a bitch if we just give them a little bit more. And I don't think that was ever a realistic assessment. I think the original, let's make it as much of a bloody nose for Vladimir Putin as we can, got turned into this hope that maybe we can beat the Russians. And I think that hope has become so ingrained now in Western leaders because they've managed to drag it along for 2 years. Hell, coming up on 3 years, right? It's been over 2.5.
In January, yeah.
That they can beat Putin at this game. I just don't know that he can be beaten. He has too many resources stored up. Even if they're 40, 50, 60 years old, they're still usable. He can throw people at this problem because that's what the Russians do. Even the wars that they've won, they win by just throwing millions of people at the problem.
That's
And
been the Russian way for 400
and the
years.
problem generally doesn't have enough people to fight that war of attrition. That's how they beat the Germans. That's how they've beat everyone that they've beat. And it's how they've lost against the Japanese. It's still millions of people. It's just whether the other side can withstand that war of attrition. And probably the Ukrainians can't because they're 1/10 the size. And so at this point, we should probably be thinking about what's the best deal we can make to end this war and to get out of this. Because this playing footsie with an actual shooting war against a nuclear armed state, and not just a nuclear armed state in that they have a couple of bombs, but in that they have an entire strategic missile command with 10,000 nuclear warheads that could depopulate the entire earth. Maybe this is not a game we'd have played with the Soviets. We would not have
the Soviets, no.
We would not have tried to push the Soviets to the wall like this. And maybe it's not a great idea to try to push their successor state, who still has all their weapons, to the wall either.
How viable are those weapons? I wonder. They threaten with it an awful lot.
Do you want to bet Chicago and Los Angeles and New York on it?
No, I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, but but there's only one way that we can answer.
I understand. I'm not talking strategically here. I'm just wondering in the ether here. The way they threaten those nuclear weapons makes me feel like they think the threat of those weapons is actually more potent than the weapons themselves. Just my gut feeling, and knowing how well maintained everything else is in Russia.
I think that's always true. Now, we have never been one to explicitly make threats like that. Although one could argue that having B-52s constantly flying at fail-safe points over the Arctic makes that threat clear enough without us actually coming out and saying anything. Right. But the fact is, it is more effective to threaten the nuclear weapons than to use them. It's one thing to drop a couple of atomic bombs on the Japanese. What's the worst that can happen? They're not going to surrender, so we'll have to drop more. It's another thing to turn the key on a missile when you have enough of a nuclear deterrent in the United States, France, and Great Britain alone to turn
and Russia, yeah.
To turn, not just Russia, but the entire planet into a smoking cinder. And by the way, we don't really have a very good idea how many nukes France actually has or where they are.
That's true.
With the British, we know that they have Trident. But the trouble with that is we don't know where they are either. they're somewhere underwater. And launch that missile.
Well, some of ours are too.
It's like what's it from Tombstone? Pull that smoke wagon and see what happens. If you can threaten nuclear weapons against an enemy that you are relatively certain will be cowed by such threats, then those threats are effective.
Right.
But
that's what Trump depended on.
But once you pull that smoke wagon, all bets are off.
All hell breaks loose. Hell's coming to breakfast.
You tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me. The support from certain politicians and groups to throw thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian lives at the Russians purely to help our own position is disquieting. Yeah, here's the thing. I'm not sure how it helps our own position. I mean, look, if your position is just a principled position of if you invade a sovereign country with your military, you're just automatically in the wrong. And if there's one thing Adolf Hitler taught us is that you need to have your face stomped in the second you try something like that. But Hitler didn't have nukes either, and Putin does. And so your options are pretty limited to basically using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder for as long as the Russians are willing to use their guys as cannon fodder. And look, it may very well be that until you have killed 500,000 or 600,000 Russians, which, by the way, we may have already done, or the Ukrainians may have already done with our help, you're just not going to be able to get the Russians to sit down to the bargaining table. It has to be a big enough bite for them to realize that the negotiating table is probably their best chance of getting half of the pie, even if they can't get all of it.
I have a feeling that the Russians might be, I mean, look, Putin has been facing a lot of opposition within his own country, within his own ranks, which is surprising considering the autocratic way he runs that country. I think they'd be willing to settle for half a pie instead of the full pie.
Now, here's the thing. Vladimir Putin is in power because he has everybody thinking that he will get the job done and that he's the only person who can. And if he shows any weakness, there are plenty of alligators in that pond who are going to start snapping. He may feel that at this point,
they should stay away from windows.
Yeah, a negotiation makes him look so weak that it might embolden. Again, it's a gangster government. All the people around him are fucking gangsters too, whether they're in uniform or not. You roll over like a weasel and expose your softer parts to these people, they're going to take a stab at it. And he may not feel like, that's the other problem. He may not feel like he's in a position to back down and not take a dive outside of some hotel room in Moscow himself.
And that's a legitimate worry. I think he probably should have. But I mean, that's the world he created. He's also a pretty clever politician. You know, he's not just warmongering, expansionist. He's been a very clever politician. He knows how to work the angles and work the factions, and has done a good enough job of it to stay in power now for what, 25 years?
Yeah. And look, so was Leonid Brezhnev.
Yeah.
But, before him.
I mean,
before Leonid.
To an end eventually.
Yeah, but before Leonid Brezhnev replaced him, so did Nikita Khrushchev. Is this as big a mistake for Putin ultimately as the Cuban Missile Crisis was for Khrushchev? Because the reason Khrushchev got bumped out of office was because he terrified the Presidium that he was going to get him into a nuclear war. Who are the fellow gangsters that run Russia's government more afraid of? Nuclear war or Vladimir Putin? So far, it's been Vladimir Putin.
I don't see that changing, but I'm not privy to, insider knowledge inside the Kremlin. So
yeah, but again, Trump will probably come in and try to broker some sort of deal because he's
already brokering a deal.
Yeah, I mean,
he's already got them talking about coming to the table.
Yeah, and
which is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah, by the way, who's president of the United States at the moment?
Yeah, no shit.
Because as far as I can tell, it's Donald Trump. Oh, well,
yeah.
With the exception of pardoning Hunter Biden. So I guess Joe Biden technically...
Although Trump did mention that he might pardon Hunter Biden.
Yeah, well, now he doesn't have to worry about doing it.
That's right.
Because Joe Biden's taking care of that for him. Anyway, Michael, as always, it's a pleasure. Have a great week. I'll talk to you next time.
All right, you too.
And for everybody who's been watching, thanks for watching. We appreciate the fact that you do and hope you'll be doing so the next time that we're back. Until then, have a great week. We'll talk to you next week. So long.